Montana Territory, 1878. The dry summer wind carried a hint of autumn across the rolling plains as Colton Chandler stood at the edge of his property, staring at the weathered wooden cross marking his brother's grave. At 26, he'd already buried more family than most men twice his age. The frontier had a way of collecting debts in blood, and Colton had paid more than his share. "I reckon it's just us now, old girl," he murmured, patting the neck of his chestnut mare. The horse nickered softly in response, shifting beneath him. Beyond the cross stretched miles of grassland, dotted with wildflowers that would soon wither under the coming frost. His small ranch house stood behind him, a lonely outpost in an unforgiving land. Colton had come to believe that attachments were dangerous in the West. Everyone he'd ever loved had been taken, his parents to cholera when he was 16, his brother to a bullet from rustlers 2 years ago. The lesson seemed clear: to survive out here, a man needed to stand alone. Love was a luxury for folks back east, where life wasn't measured by how well you could weather isolation and violence. Out here, caring for someone was just setting yourself up for more heartache when the land inevitably claimed them. Yet some nights, when the silence of his cabin pressed in like a physical weight, he wondered if survival alone was worth the emptiness. He'd built this ranch from nothing after his brother's death, turned it into something that could support a family. But what was the point of building if there was no one to share it with? Such thoughts were dangerous. Colton pushed them away as he always did, turning his horse toward town. The ranch needed supplies, and brooding wouldn't change the nature of the frontier. Pine Creek was a day's ride from his property, a small but growing settlement that served the surrounding ranches and farms. As Colton approached the bustling main street, the sounds of civilization gradually replaced the whisper of prairie grass. Wagon wheels creaking, shopkeepers calling out to passers-by, the persistent clang of the blacksmith's hammer. He just tied his horse outside the general store when a commotion erupted from the direction of the stagecoach stop. A woman's voice rose above the usual din, clear and commanding. "I assure you, sir, I am perfectly capable of managing my own belongings." Colton turned to see a young woman standing beside the dusty stagecoach, her honey-blonde hair escaping from beneath a practical bonnet. She wore a travel-worn blue dress with white trim, and despite the dust of the journey, she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. She couldn't have been more than 22, yet she faced down the burly stagecoach driver with the composure of a seasoned frontierswoman. "Miss, I'm just saying a lady traveling alone ought to." "What I ought to do is my own concern," she replied firmly. "Now, if you would kindly direct me to the nearest boarding house, I would be grateful." The driver shook his head and muttered something under his breath before pointing toward a whitewashed 2-story building down the street. As the woman gathered her carpetbag and a small trunk, Colton found himself moving forward without conscious thought. "Excuse me, miss," he said, removing his hat. "Would you like some assistance with your trunk?" She turned, and Colton was struck by eyes the color of summer skies. They widened slightly as she assessed him, and he realized how he must appear, trail-worn, with several days' worth of light stubble on his jaw. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "That would be kind, thank you. I'm Lillian Hayes." "Colton Chandler," he replied, lifting her trunk with ease. "Just arrived in Pine Creek." "Yes," she said, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the boarding house. "I'm to be the new schoolteacher." The town council wrote that the position had been vacant for some time. 8 months, Colton confirmed. The last teacher headed back east after her first winter. The cold tends to chase off folks not used to it. Lillian's chin lifted slightly. "I grew up in Minnesota, Mr. Chandler. I doubt Montana winters will frighten me away." Something about her quiet confidence intrigued him. Most newcomers to the territory arrived with either naive enthusiasm or visible trepidation. Lillian Hayes displayed neither, just a steady determination that seemed rare in someone so young. "What brings you all the way out here?" he asked as they approached the boarding house. "Teaching positions must be easier to come by back east." A shadow passed over her face so quickly he almost missed it. "I believe there's important work to be done on the frontier," she said carefully. "Children need education, no matter where they live." It wasn't the whole truth. Colton had spent enough time around poker tables to recognize when someone was holding cards close, but it wasn't his business. People came west for all sorts of reasons, and many preferred to leave their pasts behind them. They reached the boarding house where the owner, Mrs. Peterson, greeted them at the door. "You must be the new schoolteacher," she exclaimed. "We've been expecting you. Come in, come in. I've got your room all prepared." Colton set the trunk down in the entryway. "I'll leave you to get settled, Miss Hayes." Lillian turned to him with a genuine smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to truly beautiful. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Chandler." "My pleasure," he said, suddenly aware of Mrs. Peterson's curious gaze flicking between them. "Welcome to Pine Creek." As he walked back to his horse, Colton felt an unexpected lightness in his step. He reminded himself sternly that getting to know the new schoolteacher would serve no purpose. She would either leave when winter hit or marry one of the eligible men in town within a year. That was the pattern. The frontier wasn't kind to those who stood alone, but Colton had learned his lesson about attachments. Better to focus on his ranch and the coming winter than on blue eyes and a determined chin. The schoolhouse bell rang clear across Pine Creek 3 days later, signaling the start of the fall term. Colton wouldn't have paid it much mind, except that his path to the mercantile took him right past the small white building where a crowd had gathered for the occasion. Parents and children clustered around the steps, while curious townsfolk lingered nearby. Colton spotted Lillian standing at the doorway, greeting each child by name as they entered. She transformed from travel-worn to professional, wearing a crisp navy dress with her blonde hair neatly pinned up. He intended to pass by without stopping, but she happened to glance up just as he approached. Recognition flashed in her eyes, followed by a warm smile. "Good morning, Mr. Chandler," she called. Caught, he had no choice but to touch the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Miss Hayes, first day going well?" "Wonderfully so," she replied. 23 students enrolled from ages 6 to 16. Mayor Dawson, standing nearby with his wife, joined the conversation. "Miss Hayes has already impressed the town council with her credentials. Graduated top of her class from the normal school in St. Paul." Lillian looked momentarily embarrassed by the praise. A good education is the foundation of civilization, even perhaps especially on the frontier. "Well, we're mighty fortunate to have you," Mrs. Dawson added. "After the last teacher left, we worried we might not find anyone willing to come all the way out here." "I go where I'm needed," Lillian said simply, then turned as a young boy of about 8 approached shyly. "Good morning, Thomas, ready for your first day?" As she bent to speak with the child, Colton continued on his way. Something about Miss Hayes didn't quite fit the mold of the typical schoolmarm. There was a resilience there, an undercurrent of something deeper than mere dedication to teaching. But Pine Creek had seen teachers come and go, and he'd learned not to take much interest in newcomers who likely wouldn't last. It was 2 weeks later when their paths crossed again in earnest. Colton had finished his business in town and was riding home as dusk approached when he spotted a familiar figure walking along the road, about a mile outside town. Lillian Hayes trudged determinedly forward, a book clutched to her chest, her skirts gathered in one hand to keep them from the dusty road. She glanced up at the sound of hoofbeats, relief visible on her face when she recognized him. "Miss Hayes," he said, slowing his horse alongside her, "you're a long way from town." "I was visiting the Miller family," she explained. "Their daughter Emily has been ill and unable to attend school. I brought her lessons, but I'm afraid I misjudged the distance and the time it would take to walk back." Colton frowned at the darkening sky. "It'll be full dark before you reach town. Not safe for a woman alone on these roads." "So I'm discovering," she admitted with a small, rueful smile. "I thought I could make it back before sunset." He held out his hand without hesitation. "I'll give you a ride back to town." She hesitated only briefly before accepting his hand. With a strength that surprised him, she swung up behind him, settling her skirts modestly. "Thank you," she said. "This is most kind." "Hold on," he instructed, and felt her hands rest lightly at his waist. They rode in silence for a few minutes, the rhythm of the horses' hooves the only sound between them. Then Lillian spoke. "Do you live far from town, Mr. Chandler?" "About 10 miles east," he replied. "Small cattle ranch, nothing fancy, but it's mine." "You run it alone?" "Just me and a couple of hands during busy seasons." He paused. My brother and I started it together, but he's been gone 2 years now. I'm sorry, she said softly, and something in her tone suggested it wasn't merely a polite response. The frontier takes its toll, he said, more sharply than he'd intended. Yes, she agreed quietly, it does. The weight of unspoken understanding hung between them, and Colton found himself unexpectedly curious about this woman's story. Before he could formulate a question that wouldn't seem intrusive, they crested a small rise and saw Pine Creek spread out before them, windows beginning to glow with lamplight. There we are, he said, strangely reluctant for the ride to end. You'll be back before full dark after all. Thanks to your timely arrival, she said. As they approached the boarding house, she added, I've been meaning to ask. Do you have children in the district, Mr. Chandler? No, he said, never married. Oh, there was a pause. I simply wondered why I hadn't seen you at any school functions. He hesitated. Don't have much cause to concern myself with the school. Education is everyone's concern, she replied with quiet conviction. The future of this territory depends on it. When they reached the boarding house, he helped her down from the horse, her slight weight easy in his hands. For a moment they stood facing each other in the gathering dusk. The harvest festival is this Saturday, she said suddenly. The children have prepared recitations and songs, you should come. Colton hadn't attended a town social in over a year. I don't think. Please consider it, she interrupted. The children have worked very hard and, she smiled a bit hesitantly, it would give me a chance to thank you properly for your rescue today. Looking into those earnest blue eyes, Colton found himself nodding before he could think better of it. I'll try to make it. Her smile widened. Wonderful, good night, Mr. Chandler. Good night, Miss Hayes. As he rode away, Colton couldn't help wondering what had possessed him to agree. Town gatherings only reminded him of what he'd lost. The family he'd once imagined would fill his ranch house with laughter and life. But something about Lillian Hayes made him want to step outside the solitary existence he'd built for himself, if only for an evening. Just one evening, he promised himself, nothing more. Saturday arrived clear and cool, a perfect autumn day. Colton found himself taking extra care with his appearance, shaving carefully and putting on his good shirt before riding into town. The town square had been transformed with bunting and harvest decorations, hay bales arranged for seating, and tables laden with food prepared by nearly every household in the community. Children darted between adults, excitement palpable as they prepared for their performances. Colton stood awkwardly at the edge of the gathering until Sheriff Reynolds spotted him. Chandler. Haven't seen you at one of these in an age, the older man said, clapping him on the shoulder. Good to have you back among the living. Just came to see what the new teacher's accomplished, Colton replied defensively. The sheriff's eyes twinkled knowingly. Miss Hayes is certainly accomplished. Half the unmarried men in the county have suddenly developed an interest in education. Before Colton could respond, Mayor Dawson called for attention and the festival officially began. The children's performances were charming in their earnestness, poetry recitations, simple songs, and even a short play about the founding of Montana Territory. Throughout it all, Lillian stood nearby, prompting forgotten lines with a whisper or offering an encouraging nod. When the performances concluded, the crowd erupted in applause and she stepped forward with a natural grace. Thank you all for coming today, she addressed the gathering. These children are the future of Pine Creek, and I'm honored to be part of their education. A community that values learning is a community that will thrive, no matter the challenges of frontier life. There was something in her expression as she said this, a flash of deep conviction mixed with what might have been old pain that caught Colton's attention. But then she was smiling again, thanking the parents and inviting everyone to enjoy the feast. As the crowd dispersed toward the food tables, Lillian made her way to where Colton stood. You came, she said, genuine pleasure warming her voice. Said I would, he replied with a slight shrug. The children did wonderfully, didn't they? Some had never performed in public before. They did fine, he agreed, then added more sincerely, you've clearly made an impression in just a few weeks. A becoming flush colored her cheeks. I believe every child deserves a chance to discover their potential, regardless of where they're born. Even out here on the edge of nowhere. Her blue eyes flashed, especially out here. These children will build this territory's future. What they become depends largely on what they're taught to value. Before he could respond, they were interrupted by Mrs. Peterson from the boarding house. "Miss Hayes, you simply must try Mrs. Bennett's apple pie. She's been boasting it'll win first prize at the county fair next month." Lillian smiled apologetically at Colton. "Duty calls, but please enjoy the celebration, Mr. Chandler. It's good to see you here." As she walked away, Colton found himself watching her interact with the townspeople. She moved through the crowd with natural ease, listening intently to each person who approached her, bending to speak at eye level with the children. Yet occasionally, when she thought no one was looking, a shadow seemed to cross her face, a momentary retreat into private thoughts that Colton recognized all too well. The mystery of Lillian Hayes deepened. Over the following weeks, Colton found himself in town more frequently than usual. If these visits happened to coincide with the end of the school day, when Lillian might be seen walking back to her boarding house, it was merely coincidence. At least that's what he told himself. Their encounters, while brief, grew warmer with each meeting. A tip of his hat became a conversation about the changing weather, which became an offer to carry her books, which became a shared cup of coffee at the hotel restaurant while they discussed the latest news from the territorial capital. It was during one such conversation, nearly a month after the Harvest Festival, that Colton finally broached the question that had been nagging at him. "What really brought you to Pine Creek, Miss Hayes?" he asked during a lull in their conversation. "Teaching positions must be plentiful back east, in more established towns." Lillian's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her coffee cup. She was silent for so long that Colton thought she might not answer. "I needed a fresh start," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady. "I lost my family in a fire 2 years ago, my parents and younger sister, our home in St. Paul." She took a deep breath. "Afterward, everywhere I went held memories. Every corner of that city reminded me of what I'd lost." Colton felt a sharp pang of recognition. "So you came as far west as you could." She nodded, meeting his eyes directly. "Yes. I thought distance might not heal exactly, but perhaps make the burden lighter." A rueful smile touched her lips. "Instead, I seem to have carried it with me." "Some burdens can't be outrun," he said softly, thinking of his own losses. "No," she agreed, "but perhaps they can be redistributed, shared." There was a question in her eyes that made his heart beat faster. For the first time in years, Colton felt the dangerous stirring of hope, and with it came fear. Before he could respond, the restaurant door burst open and Sheriff Reynolds appeared, looking harried. "Colton, glad I found you. There's trouble out at the Carson place. Raiders hit their north pasture, drove off about 30 head. We're gathering men to track them." The spell broken, Colton rose immediately. "I'll get my rifle." He glanced back at Lillian, whose expression had shifted to concern. "Be careful," she said simply. He nodded once before following the sheriff out, the warmth of their conversation replaced by the cold reality of frontier justice. The cattle raiders led them on a 3-day chase through rough country before they finally cornered them in a narrow canyon. The ensuing gunfight left 2 of the rustlers dead and the others in custody. None of the posse was seriously injured, though Colton took a bullet graze to his left arm. By the time they returned to Pine Creek, driving the recovered cattle before them, Colton was exhausted, filthy, and more confused than ever about his feelings for the schoolteacher. The days away had given him time to think, too much time. Every argument for maintaining his solitary existence warred with memories of Lillian's smile, her quiet strength, the understanding in her eyes when he spoke of his brother. It was late afternoon when they rode into town. After delivering the prisoners to the jail, Colton intended to head straight back to his ranch, arm throbbing and mood dark. But as he passed the schoolhouse, the door opened and Lillian emerged. She stopped abruptly at the sight of him, taking in his disheveled appearance and the blood-stained bandage visible through his torn sleeve. "Mr. Chandler," she said, hurrying down the steps, "you're hurt." "It's nothing," he said gruffly, "just a graze." She frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Has it been properly cleaned?" "Out on the trail, infection is." "Miss Hayes," he interrupted, suddenly unable to bear her concern, "I appreciate your worry, but I've been taking care of myself for a long time." His tone was sharper than he'd intended, and he saw hurt flash across her face before she composed herself. "Of course," she said stiffly, "forgive my presumption." Remorse immediately flooded him, but before he could apologize, she continued, "I should tell you that I've accepted an invitation to dinner at the Collins farm this Sunday, Mr. Collins has been most attentive since my arrival in Pine Creek." James Collins was one of the wealthiest ranchers in the county, young, ambitious, and unmarried. Exactly the kind of man a sensible woman like Lillian Hayes should consider. "I see," Colton said, his voice flat. "Well, don't let me keep you from your preparations." Something like disappointment crossed her face, but she simply nodded. "Good day, Mr. Chandler. I'm glad you returned safely." As she walked away, Colton was seized by the certainty that he was making a terrible mistake. But he'd been right all along, hadn't he? Attachments were dangerous. Caring for someone meant eventual loss. Better to retreat to the safety of his isolation than risk the pain of watching Lillian build a life with someone else. He turned his horse toward home, the wound in his arm nothing compared to the ache in his chest. The winter of 1878 arrived with unusual ferocity, blanketing the territory in snow by mid-November. Colton threw himself into ranch work, expanding his herd and building a new barn with the help of his hired hands. He avoided town when possible, sending one of the hands for supplies when needed, but Pine Creek was small and complete avoidance proved impossible. He glimpsed Lillian occasionally, crossing the street with a stack of books, emerging from church on Sundays, once laughing with James Collins outside the general store. Each sighting was like a physical blow. December brought the heaviest snowfall in years. Colton had just finished checking his herd one afternoon when dark clouds rolled in with alarming speed. By the time he reached his cabin, the blizzard was upon him, howling winds driving snow so thick he could barely see his hand in front of his face. He had just settled in for what promised to be a long night when he heard a sound that froze his blood, a voice calling weakly through the storm. Grabbing his coat and a lantern, he pushed out into the blizzard, following the sound to its source. There, collapsed against the corral fence not 50 yards from his house, was a snow-covered figure. Colton brushed away the accumulating snow to reveal a face he knew all too well. "Lillian," he shouted over the wind. She was barely conscious, her lips blue with cold. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms and carried her toward the cabin. Inside, he laid her gently on the bed and worked quickly to remove her snow-crusted outer garments. Her skin was alarmingly cold, her breathing shallow. "Lillian," he said urgently, chafing her hands between his, "can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. "Colton," she whispered, relief flooded him, "I'm here." "What in God's name were you doing out in this storm?" "School," she murmured. "Children, worried they'd try to come, went to put up a notice. Storm came so fast, got lost." Her eyes drifted closed again. "No, stay with me," he said, fear sharpening his voice. "You need to stay awake." He built up the fire to a roaring blaze, then wrapped her in every blanket he owned. As color gradually returned to her face, he prepared hot coffee, adding a splash of whiskey for good measure. "Drink this," he said, supporting her head as she sipped, "slowly now." Over the next hour, he watched with relief as warmth and awareness returned to her eyes. When she was finally able to sit up unaided, he settled into a chair beside the bed. "You nearly died out there," he said, unable to keep the accusation from his voice. "What were you thinking, traveling alone with a storm coming?" "I didn't realize how quickly it would move in," she defended weakly. "I was worried about the children. And who would have helped them if their teacher had frozen to death?" He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Damn it, Lillian, you can't." He stopped abruptly, realizing he'd used her first name. She noticed too, her eyes widening slightly. "I'm sorry for frightening you," she said softly, "and thank you for saving my life." The genuine gratitude in her voice melted his anger. "How did you find my ranch in the storm?" "I didn't know it was yours," she admitted. "I just saw a light and headed for it, pure luck." "Or fate," a small voice in his mind whispered. Colton pushed the thought away. "The storm's not letting up," he said, moving to the window. Snow pelted against the glass, driven by howling winds. "You'll have to stay until it passes, might be a day or more." She nodded, seeming untroubled by the impropriety of the situation. "I'm afraid I've commandeered your bed." I've slept in worse places than my own floor, he assured her. An awkward silence fell between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the howl of the wind. Finally, Lillian spoke. You've been avoiding me. Colton stared into the flames, thought it best. Because of Mr. Collins, she asked. He looked up sharply. Are you courting him? He's asked to court me, she said carefully. I haven't given him an answer. Hope flared painfully in Colton's chest. Why not? He's a good man, wealthy, stable. Yes, she agreed, all admirable qualities. But Lillian met his gaze steadily. But when I was lost in that storm, certain I would die, it wasn't James Collins's face I saw in my mind. The confession hung in the air between them, as delicate and dangerous as a spark near gunpowder. Colton found himself moving to sit beside her on the bed, drawn by a force he couldn't resist any longer. Lillian, he said, her name a prayer on his lips, I've tried to stay away because everything I've ever loved has been taken from me. My parents, my brother, this land demands payment in grief. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. I know about loss, Colton, I've paid that price too. But I've come to believe that isolation isn't protection, it's just another kind of death. I can't lose anyone else, he whispered, voicing his deepest fear. None of us knows what tomorrow brings, she said. But I would rather have one day of true connection than a lifetime of safety in solitude. Her words struck him like physical blows, challenging the walls he'd built around his heart. And when she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, those walls crumbled entirely. The blizzard raged for 2 days, trapping them together in the small cabin. They talked for hours, about their families, their losses, their hopes that had refused to die despite everything. Lillian told him about the fire that had claimed her family, how she had been teaching late at the school that night and returned home to find her world in ashes. Colton spoke of finding his brother's body after the Rustler attack, of burying him alone on the ranch they'd built together. By the time the storm cleared, something profound had shifted between them. As they stood on his porch, surveying the blindingly white landscape, Colton knew he couldn't return to the isolation he'd once embraced. I'll take you back to town, he said, but I'd like to call on you properly, if you'll allow it. Her smile was like sunrise after the longest night. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. Word spread quickly through Pine Creek about the schoolteacher's ordeal and miraculous rescue. If there were whispers about impropriety, they were silenced by the obvious respect with which Colton treated Lillian during his courtship. He called at her boarding house 3 evenings a week, took her to church on Sundays, and was seen building bookshelves for the schoolhouse on more than one occasion. James Collins accepted the development with grace, though his disappointment was evident. You're a fortunate man, Chandler, he said when they crossed paths at the Mercantile. She's a remarkable woman. I know it, Colton replied simply. As winter gave way to spring, Colton found himself transformed. The ranch that had once felt like a monument to loss became a place of possibility. He added a bedroom, expanded the kitchen, and built a covered porch where one could sit and watch the sunset over the prairie. Lillian flourished as well, gaining confidence in her role as teacher. When she proposed evening classes for adults who wished to improve their reading and mathematics, the town council unanimously approved. Miners, ranch hands, and shopkeepers alike filled the schoolhouse 3 nights a week, their rough hands awkwardly holding pencils as Lillian guided them with unfailing patience. It was after one such class in late April that Colton waited for her outside the schoolhouse, a small box burning a hole in his pocket. When she emerged, locking the door behind her, he took her hand without speaking and led her to the small garden behind the building where spring flowers were just beginning to bloom. There, as the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, he knelt before her. Lillian Hayes, he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart, before you came to Pine Creek, I thought I knew what my life would be, solitary, safe, empty. You showed me there's another way to live, even here on the frontier. He opened the small box to reveal a simple gold band set with a single pearl. I'm asking you to build a life with me. To make my house a home, to be my wife. Tears shone in her eyes as she pulled him to his feet. Yes, she whispered against his lips, 1,000 times yes. They were married on a perfect June day in 1879, with half the county in attendance. The schoolchildren formed an honor guard outside the church, tossing flower petals as the newlyweds emerged. That evening, as they rode together toward the ranch, their ranch now, Lillian leaned against Colton's shoulder. "When I came west, I was running away," she said softly. "I never imagined I'd find a reason to stay." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "When you arrived, I was hiding from life. You brought me back to it." As they crested the final rise before their property, the setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber. The house stood waiting for them, no longer a lonely outpost but the beginning of something new. "Welcome home, Mrs. Chandler," Colton said, his voice thick with emotion. Lillian squeezed his hand. "It's been a long journey to find it, but yes, I'm finally home." In the years that followed, the Chandler Ranch became known throughout the territory for its hospitality and prosperity. Colton expanded his herd and his holdings, while Lillian continued teaching until their first child was born, a son they named David after Colton's brother. A daughter, Margaret, followed 2 years later, named for Lillian's mother. The graves on the property were not forgotten, but they no longer defined the land or its inhabitants. Instead, they became a place to tell stories, to remember those who had come before, and to teach their children about the resilience that had shaped their parents' lives. By 1885, Pine Creek had grown into a proper town with a train station and telegraph office. Progress came to the frontier, bit by bit. Yet some things remained constant, like the sight of Colton Chandler riding into town with his wife beside him, their children seated before them on their horses, their faces alight with the quiet joy of people who had found their place in the world. They had both come to Montana territory carrying burdens of grief and loss. Together, they had learned that the frontier's harshness was only part of the story. Yes, it demanded courage and exacted painful costs. But it also offered second chances to those brave enough to reach for them. She had helped him bury his past, teaching him that love wasn't a weakness but the greatest strength a man could possess. He had helped her build a future, creating a home where memories, both painful and precious, could be honored without being imprisoned by them. And in doing so, they discovered the truth that had eluded them both. That even in the wildest places, the human heart could find its way home.